72 degrees out here with the sun shining through the plastic in the boat shed, and I'm going to take advantage of it and get a bunch of parts cut and installed here in the aft end of the hull. Thanks for joining. Because the Bowler design uses an outboard installed in a well as opposed to just having the outboard engine hung off the transom, there's quite a few pieces of framing essentially that need to be installed in the building jig at this stage and then have the hull planking applied to them. So the primary piece is a motor transom that transverses the entire hull right here between stations 12 and 13. And that'll be one piece of 3/4 that spans the full width, and then an additional piece of 3/4 inch Meranti plywood that winds up in between the two motor well sides. And you can see where those motor well sides are going to go by the slots that I have right here. And both of these motor well sides are going to extend all the way back to the transom, and that's also 2 layers of 3/4 inch Meranti. So there'll be other miscellaneous pieces and parts as well as some cleats that are going to tie this part of it together. But that essentially we're going to have a motor transom and then the 2 stringers. But from the motor transom forward, there are also 2 stringers that are made out of 1/2 inch plywood that run all the way up to station 6 or 7, something like that. And they're going to form, along with the keel, essentially the backbone of the entire boat. So the goal with this episode is to get these pieces cut and dry fit and have everything ready to go for hopefully another warm day when I can epoxy them and know that it's going to stay warm enough, long enough for it to cure properly. So now we're going to head over into the shop and start cutting some of the pieces that I've already measured out for and have a go at it. No, I didn't just go change shirts right in the middle of the day. The footage that you're watching right now is recorded several weeks after the footage that you just watched. Unfortunately, in the meantime, I discovered that I was having some camera problems and the footage that I had taken was rendered unusable. So I guess it's all part of the learning curve for me, because looking back, I can see how there was maybe a little bit of operator error in there. Anyway, we haven't missed that much. There's just been a few things that I've done here with the pieces in the aft end, and I'll grab the camera here and kind of talk you through it and get you caught back up, and then we'll be right back on track. So the first thing that got done but wasn't recorded is right here. That's kind of weird. Anyway, right here, the doublers that I had just previously screwed on. I had a weather window and did some epoxy and got those stuck back on. Nothing fancy. And although I will walk you guys through the epoxy process and how I go about it, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for that coming up in the near future, and I'll cover it then. And also, I got these pieces in right here, the motor well sides, and those are the double layer 3/4 Meranti I talked about several weeks ago. And those are glued up and stuck to the motor transom along with a few other cleats. And I'll lean out over here. Hope no one gets seasick on this, but you can see the second piece that was added right there to thicken up the motor transom, and that was also glued on with thickened epoxy. And the last thing that I got cut out but wasn't able to retain footage of was this section of one of the main motor stringers, which is only partially finished and it needs to run forward for a few more stations. And I'm going to accomplish that joint not by scarfing, but by go ahead and putting in some splice blocks there at the joint and adding a few lightning holes down its length that are also going to serve to kind of increase the ventilation in the bilge area. And I think this is going to catch us right back up. Although the blank that I've set in place for the aft section of the first stringer looks good to the naked eye, I think it's cheap insurance just to make a little jig here that I can use to just double check that I've left enough meat on the blank for fairing when the time comes. So to add a belt to my suspenders, I'm deciding to check the second side while I'm at it, just to make sure that there's going to be enough there and I haven't sold myself a little short on this expensive plywood. Since my good friend Jay offered to come over and help work on the boat for the afternoon, I decided to turn him loose on making some templates for the floors that are going to go in the forward stations. Although these parts are called floors, they really aren't the part of the boat that you walk on, which is actually called the sole. So to explain this better, we'll open up a little SketchUp drawing here. So this is the sole, which is going to be made out of probably 1/2-inch plywood. And what the floors do is they provide the level surface that ties the sole down to the keel and also spreads the load for the bottom part of the bottom plywood planking out across a bigger area. So what Jay's doing is he's just transferring the lines that's going to be where the top of the floors go transferring those lines onto the station mold so that once we get some blanks for the floors glued up and set in place, we can align them properly in preparation for fairing and tying in the keel. While Jay's getting the templates finished up, I'm going to wrap up the day out here in the boat shed by attaching, temporarily at least, the blocks that are going to wind up joining the front half with the rear half of the build stringers in preparation of taking the entire assembly back into the shop and cutting out the lightning holes. The solid wood cleating that you see here is one of two pieces that each stringer is going to get, with the bottom one being mounted to the outboard side of the stringer and the top one being mounted to the inboard side once the hull is completed and flipped over. So for now, I'm just using it as a spacer to make sure that the splice blocks are attached low enough so as to not interfere with the cleats once it comes time to attach them.
Get my good side. As you turn the camera around.
It's on, it's done. I don't want to talk about how long it took me to get the mower deck put on. Anyway, it burnt up a lot of the time that I had set aside today to work on the boat, but I still have a little bit left. So to finish up this episode, what I'll do is I'll get the lightning holes or the ventilation holes cut into the build stringers that I talked about and have those ready. And also take the templates that Jay made for the floors and get them laid out on the stock that I have on hand, and maybe get the stock laminated together so that the pieces are ready to cut out once the epoxy dries. There's only a few things that I want to keep in mind as I lay out for the location of the ventilation holes, and that's make sure I leave enough meat on both the top and the bottom, and for that I just scaled off the drawings to use that as a good suggestion. And also there's a couple places where parts are going to wind up intersecting, and I want to make sure that I'm not putting a ventilation hole right where one of those attachment points is going to go. So it looks like if I were to laminate up about 5 feet of this Douglas fir, I would have enough to cut a little block out to tack on the end for station 2. And that will take care of the material I'm going to need to laminate up for the floors. Now I have two 12-foot Douglas fir 5/4 by 3.5 boards here. But the last thing I want to do is laminate them together in their entirety and then wind up not having a very good use for what's left. So I think what I'll do is I'll take one of these two boards, cut it in half, and laminate up 6 feet, and then that'll give me a whole intact 12-footer for some other purpose. Jumping ahead a few minutes, I went ahead and mixed up the first batch of epoxy to get the boards edge glued together. There's really 3 basic rules when you're working with epoxy for boat building, and the first is always wear gloves. The second is always mix the hardener and the resin, probably twice as long as you think you might need to. And the third is that epoxy likes a gap. And what that means in this instance is that once I have these board edges coated with unthickened epoxy, then thickened epoxy, and clamp them together, I'm only going to snug the clamps up just enough to start squeezing some epoxy out the sides of the joints. If you tighten up beyond that, you can actually wind up squeezing most of the epoxy out of the joint and making it weaker. Alright, so now all the mating surfaces are covered with unthickened epoxy, and so through a little bit of movie magic, I'm going to have some thickened epoxy. And here it is. So what I use to thicken the epoxy is a mixture of colloidal silica, which is the nastiest stuff you could ever breathe, and wood flour, which is essentially just really fine wood dust that I extract from my Festool dust collectors from my old cabinet business. So anyway, it's thicker. People say peanut butter. I don't know. This is a little thin for peanut butter, but this is certainly adequate. And you only have to cover one of the faces. So I did myself a favor as far as relocating these blocks by scribing around the perimeter of them with a pencil prior to taking them loose. So it makes it really easy between that and the screw holes that are already in there, just to line it right up. That one moved as I tightened the screw. There we go. Okay. And the end result is just a little squeeze out, which is what I'm seeing around the perimeter. I'll just work it in a little bit, make a tiny little fillet. And these are build stringers, so I'm not going to get any fancier than that with them. Alright, moving on to these pieces. That's a good amount right there. That'll squeeze out nicely. So this amount of squeeze out is perfect, especially for a piece that's as important structurally as the floors are. This is certainly much cheaper to throw away a little bit of extra epoxy than it is to have to repair or replace one of these in place. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. This is not much fun watching me clean this up, and I'm going to hop on the lawnmower, cut the grass, call it a day. And as always, thanks for watching, and in the next episode we're going to get the keel laminated and shape the stem and get it hopefully put on also. Thanks for joining.